Well, good afternoon. It's so nice of you to join us today. My name is Stephanie Edwards. I am a first-year South Asia concentrator here at SAIS. It is my pleasure to introduce Madiha Afzal and her newly released book, Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society, and the State. It's available for purchase in the back, as I'm sure you've seen. Today's conversation will center around the contemporary challenges that Pakistan faces regarding extremism and their connections to education policy. Madiha Afzal is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct assistant professor of global policy here at SAIS. She was previously an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. Her research lies at the intersection of development, security, and political economy with an emphasis on Pakistan studies. Dr. Afzal is the author of several book chapters and a United States Institute of Peace special report. She writes regularly for Pakistani and international publications, and she's also consulted with the World Bank and DFID. Joining Madiha on today's panel is Shmaila Chaudhary. Mrs. Chaudhary is a fellow at the Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute and senior advisor to Dean Nasser. She is a foreign policy expert specializing in counterterrorism, national security policy, and South Asia. Her work appears regularly on foreign policy, The Washington Post, Politico, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and other outlets. She has served 12 years in the U.S. government, including at the National Security Council and on the staff of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Also on today's panel is Joshua White. Dr. White is associate professor of the practice of South Asia Studies and fellow at the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He is also a non-resident fellow in the foreign policy programs at the Brookings Institution. He previously served at the White House as senior advisor and director for South Asian affairs. He coordinates many of SAIS's academic programs on Pakistan, including an upcoming conference April 16th and 17th here at SAIS, co-sponsored with the Pakistani University alums that will focus on Pakistan's future. So mark your calendars for April 16th and 17th. Today's event will start with a presentation by Professor Afzal. It will be followed by a discussion with our panelists, moderated by Shmaila Chaudhary. After a brief dialogue with each other, the panelists will take questions from the audience. And now just a word about today's topic. In the preface to Dr. Afzal's book, she poses a question: are ordinary Pakistanis extremists? And this is a question that I wrestled with as an observer, but also an outsider to Pakistani debates about religion and violence. And I will never forget being in Islamabad the day of the attack on the army school in Peshawar, and a line of college-aged men linked arms and started to block the main road that I was traveling on the way home. And thankfully, they let my car through, but I watched out the back window as this crowd just gathered to mourn the children killed. And that day, those men took a small but peaceful stand against terrorism. And yet we've seen the other end of the spectrum so many times as well. For example, when less than a year ago, college students at Abdul Wahid Khan University murdered a fellow classmate over unfounded blasphemy charges. I think that you will find the survey data and field research insights that are presented and discussed here today can, at the very least, help to make this paradox at least a little bit more explicable. And with that, please join me in welcoming Madiha Afzal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you for having me here at this event. So I am really looking forward to the discussion with Shmaila and Josh in a few minutes. But before we go there, I thought I would just give you a little bit of a brief survey of the findings in my book. So over the last 15 years, and more, actually, since 9/11, Pakistan has really come to be defined in one dimension, and that's in terms of its relationship with terrorism. And the work on Pakistan tends to look at it from sort of a top-down security perspective. And this book really takes a different approach. I look at attitudes of Pakistani people and then set out to explain these attitudes. So if we think about how Pakistan is characterized in the West, it's either as the victim of terrorism, and even by conservative estimates, more than 25,000 Pakistanis have died since 2007. And most of these deaths have been at the hand of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which has staged an insurgency in Pakistan's northwest. So it's either as the victim of terror, or it is as the perpetrator of terrorism, whether it be through sort of non-state militant groups that target India or that target Afghanistan from Pakistan's territory, or whether it be people of Pakistani descent who target the West. And then if we think about Pakistanis themselves, really when we look at what we see in newspapers, we see sort of a vision of Pakistanis as irrational kind of fundamentalists who turn out to rallies held by Hafiz Saeed, who's the leader of Lashkar-e-Taiba, who, at the slightest provocation, it seems to us, chant death to America. And so the question really, starting out from that kind of perception that we have, that is only a small part of the story. The question really is, are ordinary Pakistanis extremists? And so I set out by explaining Pakistani attitudes through survey data and interviews I've done in Pakistani schools and universities. And so I'm going to go through some of these findings of the survey data, and then I will go through why these attitudes have come to be, what explains them. And so the first thing I want to start out with is a number that's a positive number, and that's 89%, okay? So, and that's how the book starts as well. So 89% of Pakistanis think that, or say in a survey, that violence in the name of Islam against civilians, right? Violence in the name of Islam against civilians is never justified. All right? So Pakistanis reject jihadist violence, according to that number. And then I'm going to show you this table, which essentially shows Pakistanis' views on terrorist groups, including groups that target Pakistan itself, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, right? And that has been sort of the main group that has targeted Pakistan, as well as groups that target what are seen as Pakistan's enemies, right? So Lashkar-e-Taiba, which targets India, Al-Qaeda, which targets the West, the Afghan Taliban, which targets Afghanistan in particular. And the thing that you see in this data is that Pakistanis are by far more unfavorable towards all these groups than they are favorable towards these groups. So the favorability numbers range from 9% for the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan to 14% only for Lashkar-e-Taiba. And this is in 2015. And unfavorability is high. The numbers range from 60% for the Taliban Pakistan to around 40% for the Lashkar-e-Taiba. A significant proportion of Pakistanis don't respond to these questions, and we can go into why later on. So that's also a good sign, right? So in some sense, I start out with the positive news. And then things get murkier as you dig deeper, both in terms of the survey data as well as narratives. So I will go through this table, which documents. So this data is from 2015. Just a word on this. Views we saw became much more unfavorable towards terrorist groups as Pakistan itself became the target of terror. So views became more negative from 2013 to 2015. And 2014 is when the Army public school attack, which targeted school children in Peshawar and killed more than 130 school children, as was just mentioned, happened. And so after the Army public school attack, sentiment really became much more negative towards the Pakistan Taliban, but not just the Pakistan Taliban, towards all terrorist groups that target not just Pakistani citizens, but citizens of other countries as well. Now, on Al-Qaeda, this data is from 2009, and it presents a paradox. Okay, even as Pakistanis are broadly negative towards Al-Qaeda, right? You see two things. You see the majority of Pakistanis oppose Al-Qaeda's attacks on Americans. So again, they're rejecting the notion of violent jihad. But also, you see that a majority of Pakistanis say they share its attitudes towards the US, share Al-Qaeda's attitudes towards the US. So while there's a rejection of violence, there's an acceptance of jihadist ideology, all right? And so that is the puzzle that I set out to explain. I'm going to go through a couple of other graphs in a little bit. So if you dig deeper in terms of narratives on the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is actually the group that has targeted Pakistanis, in interviews and in discussions, I saw a few narratives emerge. And I'm going to go through a couple of quotes which will elucidate some of those narratives. So the first really is a linking of the terrorism that occurs in Pakistan with the US war on terror in Afghanistan. All right? And so I'll actually just go forward with a quote. And this is actually from a book by Anatol Levin, Pakistan, a Hard Country, which is an excellent book. And a Lahori shopkeeper that he interviewed put it thus. He said, "The Taliban are doing some bad things, but you have to remember that they're only doing them in self-defense because the Pakistani army took American money to attack them." All right? So the idea is that the Taliban is justified in its actions because it's really only a defensive action. A second type of narrative really pins the blame on both India and the US for the terrorism that Pakistan faces as kind of a conspiracy theory argument. So a student I interviewed in Lahore sort of put it thus. He said, "We say that bomb blasts are done by the Taliban, but the major cause is the Americans and the Indians, the American agencies and the Indian agencies." All right? The third kind of narrative that came out is more of an ideological narrative. And a high school teacher whom I interviewed said about the Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, "They want Islam too. It is the duty of Muslims to spread God's words. They are just fulfilling their duties. Now you can call them either terrorists or jihadis." So the idea is that the Pakistan Taliban were trying to implement a system of Sharia in Pakistan, and that is why they were engaging in terrorism. So as you dig deeper, as I said, the 60% favorability number is underlying the 60% unfavorability number are these much more problematic narratives that are either based on conspiracy theories or kind of an ideological defense of the Pakistan Taliban, and that show a latent sympathy, right, for these groups, if not the violence that they're undertaking. All right. I want to mention just a couple of things on attitudes that are relevant. One is attitudes on the blasphemy law, which I'll mention in a little bit about what the blasphemy law actually is. But 75% of Pakistanis interviewed by Pew think that the blasphemy law is necessary to protect Islam in Pakistan. And 75% also favor the death penalty for converts who leave Islam. Okay? All right. So we'll talk about those numbers in a little bit. If you look at where these attitudes come from, the the root of these attitudes, I argue in my book, is really the Pakistani state. They have not emerged in a vacuum. And the Pakistani state really has identified itself and defined itself in terms of two pillars. And those are reliance or a definition of itself as an Islamic state and a state that has an existential fear of India, a state that lives in existential sort of threat from India. And when you look around in Pakistan doesn't, if you look at the workings of the bureaucracy or the military or the civilian government, you might be fooled into thinking that it's not really a state that's ideologically Islamic. But what underlies sort of all of Pakistan's decisions has been this commitment to itself, to its view of itself as an Islamic state that is anti-India. So if you go around in Pakistan, you'll actually see the slogan, Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. So Pakistan very literally defines itself as an Islamic state. The army's motto is actually Iman, Taqwa, Jihad, which means faith, piety, and holy war. It is actually the fact of Pakistan defining itself in terms of Islam and in opposition to India has led to the dominance of its army. It has led, Pakistan has been committed to this narrative of sort of a focus on Islam and an anti-India narrative through regimes that are both military and civilian, and through leaders that are both personally secular and religious. All right? And it's done this not because of an ideological commitment to religion, but because Pakistan relied on Islam as part of its nationalist project, as part of the need to unify its different ethnicities, as part of the need to define itself as different from India, and as part of the need to sort of defend itself from India. All right? And these two sort of pillars that have defined the Pakistani state have impacted both the state's policy, and I'm going to go through sort of some elements of that, as well as attitudes of the Pakistani people. And it's done this through the state's sort of politics and the state's narrative on militant groups, as well as the laws it has put in place, and as well as the education system that it has put in place. All right, so I want to go through a couple of sort of major highlights of sort of the politics and the laws, and then I'll show you a couple of graphs that highlight the education issue, just to sort of give you a preview of what's ahead. So in terms of sort of the narratives on terrorist groups, you'll actually see that the conspiracy theory narrative that people have on terrorist groups really emerges out of the Pakistani state's own narrative on these groups. So when the Pakistan Taliban was engaging in attacks against Pakistani citizens and claiming these attacks, you could be fooled into thinking as a Pakistani citizen that it was not really the Pakistan Taliban who was conducting these attacks, because the Pakistani state would obfuscate. It would say that any attack was a conspiracy to derail Pakistan, was a conspiracy to derail whatever the civilian government was trying to engage in at the time. So it's a conspiracy to derail the China-Pakistan economic corridor, for instance, and so on. All right. The Pakistani state had a very worrisome narrative on the Pakistan Taliban as the insurgency was developing. It only changed really its narrative on the Pakistan Taliban, the TTP, in 2014. But as the insurgency was developing in the mid-2000s, it thought that it could contain the insurgency. So it actually referred to the TTP as our brothers. There's a general, a Pakistani army general, General Safdar Hussain, who said that Baitullah Mahsood, who went on to become one of the leaders of the TTP, was a patriotic soldier of Pakistan when he was trying to engage in peace talks with them. The two pillars that have lane, sort of everything that the Pakistani state has done, have actually impacted its policy on engaging in the Afghan jihad. And of course, there's the Pakistan engaged in the Afghan jihad with U.S. Financial and logistical support, as well as Saudi support. And it underlies Pakistan's support of non-state groups that target India, right? So that's a little bit about sort of politics and the narrative, but I can go into more there afterwards in the discussion on laws. Pakistan is engaged in sort of an Islamization since its inception. Again, in service to this sort of the narrative that Pakistan has on it, on its own state. But the initial Islamization was relatively innocuous and slow, gradual. It is in sort of the 70s and in particular in the 80s that Pakistan really engaged in some regressive Islamization in terms of its legal system, in particular under General Zia. So in the mid-1980s, General Zia put in place blasphemy laws that had already existed during British colonial times. But he changed the blasphemy laws in Pakistan's penal code. And what these blasphemy laws now did was offenses that anybody could think of subjectively as something that was offensive towards the Quran or something that was offensive towards the Prophet Muhammad were now punishable with imprisonment for life or death. Okay, so blasphemy became a capital offense in Pakistan in the mid-1980s. And we see its effect on the numbers of blasphemy cases that have come up. Before 1985, there were a handful of blasphemy cases. After 1985, blasphemy cases, and these are just the recorded ones, right? Blasphemy cases have gone up to more than 1,300, all right? So the whole rhetoric on the blasphemy law is virulent, and anyone who even argues for reform of the law is accused of blasphemy and thus can be targeted with vigilante violence. So nobody has actually been put to death for blasphemy in Pakistan, though there are at least 40 people on death row for blasphemy. But vigilante violence, cases of vigilante violence are, abound. And you just mentioned one at the beginning. And we have at least sort of 50 cases of recorded vigilante violence, but the numbers are likely to be higher. All right, I want to get back to showing you some data as I wrap up. So I want to show you views of the TTP by education level. All right, so we have this kind of narrative of this perception of education as improving attitudes, this view was debunked by some studies done in the mid 2000s, late 2000s. My work largely actually supports the argument that views of terrorist groups improve with education. And so what you see is that net unfavorability. So the percentage of people who are unfavorable towards terrorist groups minus the percentage of people who are favorable towards terrorist groups increases with education. So people become more unfavorable on net towards terrorist groups with education. But there is an interesting and important story to be told in terms of the numbers of people who are favorable towards terrorist groups. So if you just, I'm going to use the pointer here. If you just look at these, the first little sort of bars for each of the education levels, that's the number who are favorable. And those numbers are small, but you see an interesting trend, or two interesting trends. The number of the percentage of people who are favorable towards terrorist groups, or in particular, this is the TTP here, they don't go away for people even with university degrees. So favorability remains a concern even at the university level. And two, favorability actually goes up for middle and secondary school relative to people who have no school, which is worrisome. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pakistan's curricula in an attempt to explain that. So I actually studied curricula for the high school for Pakistan studies, and there are many problems with those books, but they start out with this notion of the Pakistan ideology being equivalent to Islam. They glorify jihad. There are biases in these books that are very anti-India, less anti-American, though there's anti-American sentiment there. And then the way students study these books are that there's rote learning and there's no critical thinking taught in the classroom. So my argument is not that and these are books that reach the vast majority of people who go to high school. We can talk about madrasas afterwards in the discussion, but these are books that are the government school textbooks that reach the vast majority of Pakistani students who are in secondary school. It's not that they make people extremists or make students extremists, but they set up a framework of the world that, combined with the fact that there's no critical thinking to speak of, when students actually encounter extremist propaganda, which is not hard to encounter, they are unable to counter it. All right? And in fact, they sort of reinforce some of these views that you might think of as propaganda. So that's sort of a little bit about the curriculum at the middle and secondary school level. The second sort of graph that I wanted to show you is the views on the death penalty for those leaving Islam by education. We see that these views, so this is basically, do you think that people should be punished by death for apostasy? These views don't really change with education. The vast majority of Pakistanis agree that this makes sense. And my argument is that it is the fact that Pakistan's education system does nothing. The important thing is that Pakistan's education system, again, instituted by its own state, does nothing to counter these views. It enforces them. It reinforces them through the focus, the excessive focus on Islam. In one of the textbooks that I studied for Pakistan studies, Islam was mentioned 255 times, and really a very thin Pakistan studies textbook. This is not an Islamic studies textbook. So the focus on Islam and then Pakistan's laws make sure that these views are ingrained in the population, even through those who have university degrees. All right. So I'm aware that I've gone, for quite a few minutes. If you'll indulge me, I will just go through, where I think Pakistan is right now and what can be done. So as I mentioned, Pakistan has undertaken, has changed its views on the TTP after 2014. And the military has actually undertaken two very sort of ominously named campaigns against the TTP. One called the Zarb-e-Azb, literally sort of the prophet's sword. The other called Raddul Fasad, which means, to rid Pakistan of all of its problems. And it has largely decimated the TTP. And so it thinks its work is done, right? So it has not taken action against the terrorist groups that are on Pakistani soil that target India and Afghanistan. In fact, it thinks of them still as assets. And more broadly, it has not taken any action against extremists. And extremism in particular. So Pakistan had a national action plan that it put out in January of 2015 that was a decent document. There were problems in it, but it talked about taking action against extremist literature, hate literature, and so on, and taking action against militant madrasas. But the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government in Pakistan's northwest has been diverting more and more funds to the most militant of Pakistan's madrasas, the Darul Uloom Haqqaniya. My RA was able to find, at Lashkar-e-Taiba's shop in Lahore, was able to find its magazines and propaganda. And in 2015, these magazines and propaganda glorified ISIS. The students that I interviewed who had the most the most extreme of views are actually swayed by the propaganda of extremist and fundamentalist groups. So it's very important to counter this propaganda, but the government doesn't do this. And more broadly, the government still thinks, the Pakistani state as a whole still thinks of secular bloggers as more of a threat and targets them than it targets Hafiz Saeed or Abdul Aziz of the militant Red Mosque in Islamabad. So, it hasn't come to terms with the fact that the ideologies of the LET and the Afghan Taliban overlap with the ideologies of the TTP. It hasn't come to terms with the fact that Abdul Aziz and Hafiz Saeed are the real existential threat to Pakistan. And really, what it needs to do in order to sort of reset course is not just military and kinetic action, but it is a fundamental ideological sort of realignment and a sort of a reimagination of itself as a modern Muslim democracy, as opposed to a state that defines itself in religious terms and in negative terms vis-a-vis India. So I will stop here, and I look forward to the discussion with Shamaila and Josh. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Can you hear me? But you can hear me, of course. I don't even need this. Okay, thank you so much. And it's my honor to be up here with colleagues and friends. And in Madiha's book, she also quotes Josh, who has done extensive work on Islamist parties in Pakistan. So this is a real treat for us, for those of you who are interested in getting some kind of in-depth perspectives on this topic. So I'm going to get Oprah Book Club on you guys. You have to buy this book because if SAIS hosts a book event, it just, it gets sold out, the book. So you have to get this book because what it does is it takes an issue that's been overwhelmingly sensationalized in our media, in the US, in the Pakistani media, and globally. And it looks at the Pakistani people, ordinary Pakistanis, as individuals with their own stakes, with their own domestic concerns. They're humans. And this is something that we have been missing in our entire education about this country because of the focus on security, right? So essentially it encourages us to look at security issues from a different perspective, which I think is very valuable. Especially given kind of the U.S. role in South Asia and the challenges that it continues to face. Clearly, a new perspective is very much in need. So get the book. And what I learned from reading this, I learned so much, first of all. I've been working on Pakistan for a long time, and I learned so much. And the first thing that came to mind was, okay, so there are actually so many participants in the narrative of extremism that get ignored. We tend to just think of it being an issue between states or non-state actors and a state. But in fact, there are ordinary people, there are terrorists, there are also the Islamist parties, which the book gets into a lot of detail towards the end. And then there are regional actors and civilians and military, right? And so it made me realize that we've been looking at this issue in really black and white terms. And if we're to learn, if we're to discover better solutions for these challenges, we have to learn all these perspectives. And one thing, as a former US policymaker myself, I often struggled with was how the Pakistani state dealt with Islamist parties and how it dealt with militants. And there's a kind of a trend that we saw several years back. The US would pressure the Pakistani government to do something about terrorism. And the Pakistani government would try to negotiate peace deals with militants, with the assistance often of Islamist parties. And when they did that, we got really upset. We didn't want them to talk to terrorists or militants. And so it was kind of a catch-22 for them, the Pakistani government. They both had to show that they were serious about fighting terrorism and make use of the relationships that they did have on the ground, but at the same time, it was wrong for them in some ways to have those relationships. And so I was hoping that both of you could get into this kind of these complex dynamics a little bit more, and talk about why does this. You did a great job, Madiha, of explaining why or how we got to this point with extremism. But why has this culture and kind of environment been sustained for so long? And talk about it in the context of these kind of state dynamics, the relationships between the military and the civilians and the Islamist parties, and maybe even, Josh, like the role that the US has played in that conversation.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And can everybody hear me? Okay, great. That's an excellent question. So Pakistan's politics, its internal politics, have really been kind of critical to what has transpired in the country. Sort of the civilian military, the struggle between the civilian and military governments. And then Islamist parties as a player that Pakistan's civilian governments feel they need because they are weak, and so they feel Islamist parties provide them with support in terms of sort of coalition building in parliament. And then Islamist parties are also a player that Pakistan's military uses against its civilian government. And so it's the reason why this has sustained itself for so long. I mean, I can point you towards a sort of a few maybe examples of the various roles that these the civilian, military, and Islamist parties as sort of three separate actors have played. So think of Islamist parties, for instance. They have been instrumental in the designation of the minority group in Pakistan known as Ahmadis as non-Muslim through agitation and street sort of protests, and a student wing, the Islami Jamiyat-e-Tulaba, the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami party, which has gone into the sort of headquarters of the Ahmadis and sort of fought with them, literally, taken up sort of violence, and then they engaged in sort of this massive concerted 100-day campaign to have Ahmadis declared non-Muslim, and they were, and the civilian government felt like it had to give in to them because its hold on power has usually always, Pakistan's civilian governments up till I would say 2013, have always felt that their hold on power, and they're not doing much better right now, but there isn't the sense that the military is going to take over right now officially, though the military is certainly the more powerful player right now in Pakistan. But Pakistan's civilian governments have been sort of always one step away from feeling like the military is going to take over. And so they have engaged in giving concessions to Islamist groups, such as the declaration of Ahmadis as non-Muslim. So sort of that's one example. That has led to extreme intolerance against Ahmadis, that has led to blasphemy charges against Ahmadis, and that has actually led to sort of a tolerance of terrorism that strikes these groups. So when Ahmadis are targeted by terror, the sympathy towards them, as they were in 2010, for instance, there were twin attacks that killed almost 100 Ahmadis in Lahore, the sympathy was muted. The sympathy towards the victims of terror in Pakistan has tended to be contingent on the group that is targeted, right? And so it is only when the Peshawar Army Public School attack happened and Pakistanis saw young children as victims of terror, and young children just like their own, that they really turned against the TTP. So that's sort of the Ahmadi issue. In terms of the civilian, and that'll be sort of my second point, and then I'll hand it over to Josh. In terms of the civilian versus military struggle, Pakistan's military has always sort of held back against the civilians engaging in a redefinition of its central kind of paradigm, really. And so I'll give you the example of the Dawn Leaks, I guess, case. It's come to be called Dawn Leaks, but in the summer of 2016, there was apparently a very high-profile meeting between the civilian leaders, Nawaz Sharif, Shehbaz Sharif, and then the leaders of Pakistan security agencies. And apparently the civilians said, we need to stop supporting the Afghan Taliban and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and we need to, sort of shift gears. And this was a secret meeting, and but news leaked out and was reported the next day in Pakistan's Dawn newspaper. Hence, this was called Dawn Leaks. The military government, not the military government, but the military really just was furious at this and made Nawaz Sharif apologize. Engage in denial, and then B, apologize, which is kind of for the meeting, which doesn't make much sense because he's denying that it happened and then apologizing for it. But what appeared to be at stake there was the fact that the civilian government was trying to assert itself and assert its vision of security policy over the military. So that was not something the military could not accept. And then the second was an open acknowledgement of the fact that the military has in fact been supporting these non-state actors, or the security agencies have been supporting these non-state actors. And that was unacceptable to the military government as well. And so that actually shows you this kind of, the military always having the upper hand over the civilians. That this incident sort of nicely illustrates that. And the military constantly pushes back, and Pakistan security agencies constantly push back at any shift in the central definition and the central paradigm of Pakistan, because the military derives its sustenance from the fact that Pakistan is a state in opposition to India. That's what gives its power and sustenance, and so it pushes back on it. And so far, since the dynamic has not shifted, many of these trends have remained, have only been accentuated.
Great, thanks. It's great to be here, and I think what Madiha laid out is very important because it highlights the centrality of the state in shaping narratives and the state's interest in shaping narratives. These don't arise from nowhere. It also highlights the role of education and the curriculum, not in driving people in a certain direction, but in a sense softening up the ground for people who come through this educational process to be open to crossing a line into violent radicalism because of the context of what they've been taught. So I think that's very important. I would just say a few things to the question of why has this continued? Like, what sustains these dynamics? And I would say first that, in my view, it's not only that the Pakistani state has incentives driven by an external threat, that is by India. And you go to Pakistan, that's obvious. The view about India is not, subtle and opaque. It's fairly clear what the prevailing view is. But also that there is a deep concern within the state apparatus about Pakistan's own ethnic and to some extent religious diversity and linguistic diversity. This is a state that is, it's easy for us Americans to forget, that in 1971 they lost half their country. Like that's a big deal if you're a state, to lose half of your country, lose half of your population. And the narrative in Pakistan is that came because of internal ethnic linguistic separatism reinforced by India. So a state that is that concerned about internal fragmentation has all of these incentives to pivot to the one idea that seems to be unifying, which is an Islamic discourse. And we see that again and again. And I understand that if I were a Pakistani security planner, I too would be concerned about internal ethnic fragmentation, about linguistic divisions, about interprovincial tensions. I might hope they would resolve it in a different way, but this is a driving concern. This leads to my second point, which is that in an environment in which religion is seen as the only issue that can unify the country, the religious parties and the religious actors have a very useful tool at their disposal, which you can call the ratchet effect, which is that they continue to escalate the rhetoric about how Pakistan is and must be only an Islamic state. Here's what an Islamic state means. And even the majority of people who might disagree with that view don't want to push back on it because the bar has been raised. This is not a phenomenon unique to Pakistan. I grew up in a politically and religiously conservative Christian community, and there were many ways in which this behavior is very familiar. Nobody wants to be outflanked by being not religious enough, by being not conservative enough. And so the players on the fringe define the agenda, they define the boundaries of what's acceptable, and everybody else kind of stays silent. And I think there's very much this sort of sociological dynamic that's happening here. The third thing I would say is about state capacity to deal with this. There have been many debates in academic settings, in the US government. Okay, is the Pakistani state unable or unwilling to deal with the problematic groups that operate from its territory? And there's a camp of unwilling advocates and a camp of unable advocates who say, well, it's one or the other. And I think what we have seen is that if you are unwilling for long enough, you find yourself to some extent unable. That the sustained unwillingness to deal with an environment in which groups have freedom of action, to have rallies in which they're inciting violence, to operate camps, after a while you find yourself boxed into a corner where it gets much harder to deal with these groups because you have allowed them to cultivate public acceptance, legitimacy, infrastructure, ties to legitimate organizations. They create their own charities. Their charities create their own front organizations. Pretty soon you have an ecosystem of groups that are hard to deal with without blowback, and it becomes much harder even if you're willing to take action against those groups. And that, I think, is the environment that Pakistan has found itself in which the debate is not nearly as binary. And I think it's then incumbent on policymakers and those observing from the outside to figure out not how do you destroy all these groups, how do you unwind the problem that you have let accumulate in your own backyard, right? How do you begin to unwind legitimacy, infrastructure, linkages to legitimate organizations, fronts, all of the things that you've let happen so that you're in a position to use your will to do something about it. You could probably make similar analogies to the educational space or others, but I think with respect to the groups that operate, that appears to be one of the dynamics that has allowed this to be sustained.
It's very well put. And I would also add that there are several examples from other countries that have reintegrated individuals who've participated in militant activity, and unfortunately, that didn't happen after the Afghan Soviet War, and a lot of the groups that the United States and the Pakistanis supported continued their activities as if everything were normal, and so I think that also was a contributing factor that there was no plan for reintegration into society, and I don't think that it's really been tried in Pakistan in the past decade. And I wanted to ask Josh to elaborate on one more thing and also get Madiha's take on this. Josh, you were at the White House during a time period in the past few years where the Pakistani military would say that they were taking action against extremism, and it was, as Madiha was saying, a concerted effort and a campaign to rid Pakistan of all evil. And so how would you characterize those actions of the past few years for our group today, are they selective? And are they usually, I mean, I personally saw them in response to perhaps a troubled relationship with the United States, and there was some funding that was threatened, and so the Pakistani military would take action, but it was never something that was sustained. That's just kind of one example, but I'd appreciate your kind of characterization of that.
Sure. This is, there's been years of frustration here in Washington, but I think now seen as an academic, this is a fascinating case, again, of this question of capacity versus will. I've observed that when the Pakistani state really wants to do something, surprise, surprise, it can usually really do it. This is a relatively strong state with a relatively strong and large military and a set of security institutions that are quite capable. And so when they set their mind to something, it's amazing what can happen. And we've seen this in those occasions where the state identified that the Pakistani Taliban, the groups targeting civilians, targeting military installations, were bad. They decided very decisively, these groups are bad. And so you watch what they did. Well, sometimes they negotiated with them, but they also found ways to delegitimize them. They found ways to engage in targeted killings of the leaders. They found ways to constrict the space in which they were operating. And they found ways to make sure that all of the legitimate Islamic groups operating in Pakistan had incentives to cut ties with the groups that were targeting the state. In other words, they did what you would expect a responsible and capable state to do in addressing a problem on its own territory, targeting state institutions, right? So my perspective would be, when they want to, they can. And they have a toolkit that, by analog, they could use against a range of groups that they are not so excited about taking out. Groups that target the Afghan government or the US in Afghanistan, groups that target the Indian state. And again, they box themselves into a corner on some of those, but there are ways to walk away from the corner, right? There are ways to begin to employ this toolkit in delegitimizing organizations and cutting their ties to legitimate organizations, the whole range of things. And so in that sense, I think the frustration in Washington over Pakistan's selectivity in dealing with these groups has often engendered a view here that we just advocate blunt activity by Pakistan. Do the same blunt things against these guys that you did against those guys. And I think that fails to recognize the box that Pakistan has put itself in and the need for it to, if it's going to take action, to do so in a more sort of stepwise kind of way. So that would be my own view, but I think that they can take action, and they have been selective based on their own threat perceptions.
Yeah. So I think just to sort of add to that, there's Pakistan doesn't quite recognize, in my view, the links between the kind of extremism that I have talked about, the attitudes of the ordinary Pakistani, and then the views of terror and the ideology of terrorist groups and how they are connected. And it came close to this in outlining its national action plan, where it actually said, we're going to counter extremist and hate propaganda. What extremist and hate propaganda? Where did this extremism and hate come from? How have you, the state, engendered this extremism and hate through your own laws and education system? That it did not address. And because it did not address that, it has taken no action against its laws or its public school education system, right? It did recognize that madrasas were militant, right? So it actually recognized that, again, there are some militant madrasas that do create, that feed directly into terrorist groups. But again, the action on that has been selective. So Pakistan has taken very concerted action against, the group that it saw as posing an existential threat to it, the TTP. But the action on everything else, even the factors that it recognized in the National Action Plan, the madrasas, and sort of people like Hafiz Saeed, for instance. It said, it's not going to differentiate between terrorist groups, right? It has taken very selective action against them by, putting Hafiz Saeed under house arrest when the pressure was high last year, and then releasing him, as it has done. This is not sort of the one instance where it's done this. It's done this repeatedly over the last, couple of decades. The Pakistani state always says that it doesn't have evidence to hold Hafiz Saeed, right? So there are two things there. One is this kind of the fact that it doesn't quite realize the existential threat these people and these narratives sort of have against it or put against it. But the other factor is that it also, as Josh sort of mentioned, it fears blowback. It actually fears the street power of supporters of the Lashkar-e-Taiba who don't actually quite even understand, or people who are sympathetic to Hafiz Saeed, who think, hey, this is a guy who's an erstwhile university professor. He was an engineering university professor who is just an Islamist. They don't quite understand the links to violence, and they fear the blowback from the street. And the blowback, of course, comes from ordinary citizens of the type that the Pakistani state has made into people who think that this kind of extremism is okay. I think the one other thing that I'll sort of highlight is the fact that militant groups have this kind of rhetoric that we're only engaging in terrorism to impose or to bring about an Islamic system in Pakistan. So they'll actually say we're engaging in violence to do that. But Islamist groups will also say that their ultimate goal is to have an Islamic system in Pakistan, right? And that Pakistan doesn't have an Islamic system now. And the civilian government, the Pakistani state, does nothing, and the Pakistani state, of course, defines itself as an Islamic republic. And so it's boxed in terms of that as well, because it never articulates why the militant groups and even the Islamists are wrong in their desire to impose Sharia or impose an Islamic system in Pakistan, and where the Pakistani state itself, how is it going to define itself? It's kind of very, it's actually for a state that's kind of has defined itself in this type of ideology, it's not very articulate when it comes to describing what exactly the Islamic system that it envisions for itself is. That system is what its constitution tells it, and its constitution is not a constitution governed by Sharia. Its constitution has Islamic elements, right? And so it never quite articulates that to push back against the narratives of both militant groups and Islamist groups. And I think therein lies its weakness.
So one thing I observed in when I was working on these policy issues was that the United States was also pretty selective about which groups it targeted. For example, if you look at the white paper that the Obama administration put out when it did its strategy review, we were very cautious to say that the enemy is Al-Qaeda. The enemy is not the Afghan Taliban, right? And to which the United States got and continues to get a lot of criticism, because if only the enemy were also the Afghan Taliban, then this war would be over, and then we could have gone into Pakistan and gotten them out of Quetta where they were based, right? But the US had a very distinct national security interest to protect, which was, we're going to have to work with the Afghan Taliban one day. We're going to need them to be part of some kind of peace process or reconciliation discussion, and if they are the stated enemy and we pursue kind of a variety of measures against them, it will take longer because we have to undo those measures before we can get to the table. So it's not, I don't see it as a distinctly Pakistani phenomenon, but I do see it as kind of an inherent kind of part of their national security strategy, and not just kind of independent of the world. I mean, they have it because of India, but they also have it because of Afghanistan, right? So they're Pakistan is essentially surrounded by unfriendly neighbors, with the exception of a small border it shares with China. So it's also boxed itself in that way, in that regard, with if you think about regional politics and how it's managed its relationships and how those countries have managed their relationships with the Pakistanis, which leave it very little kind of option and room to maneuver, and which then translated into the US having very, very few options when dealing with a country like Pakistan. So I mentioned China, and I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the group. throughout your analysis, a few times you've mentioned Saudi Arabia and the conversation about extremism in Pakistan. Most of it was actually about the United States and India when talking about foreign actors. I'd be curious to know from your field work how Saudi Arabia was characterized in the conversations about extremism. I think for most Americans, we often eventually get to Saudi Arabia when trying to explain the rise of extremism in Pakistan. They've funded and supported mosques and madrasas. They've done this all over the world. So how did that factor in your conversations?
Yeah. Interestingly, it didn't factor in much in my conversations with students and teachers. Obviously, as you mentioned, the Saudi Arabian sort of Wahhabi ideology has been really key to the sort of the intolerance that has seeped through the madrasas in Pakistan, and of course these madrasas have existed before the Soviet-Afghan war in the 1980s. They existed in the 1970s, but then they were kind of repurposed and armed with this Wahhabi ideology and with actual arms to create the Mujahideen. But when I asked students in sort of schools and universities about these issues, I asked them about what they thought. I didn't actually even directly ask them about the Taliban, right? So the way I asked questions was to try to draw them out. I had long conversations with them that lasted hours, and they were very generous with their time and very open with their views. And so I asked them about who they thought was causing terrorism in Pakistan. I asked them about their views of other countries. So I said, who would you think of as Pakistan's friend, and who would you think of as not Pakistan's friend? And so that's where the discussions of sort of China and the US and India came in. In terms of Saudi Arabia, it really actually only came into play in sort of one discussion in which the students sort of very openly said that we really don't like Saudi Arabia because of the discriminatory attitude that Saudis have towards Pakistanis who go and work there and because there are a lot of Pakistanis, there's a significant proportion of Pakistanis who go abroad go to the Gulf states and send a huge amount of remittances from working there to Pakistan, and so it supports many families. But they said that from their personal experience, their families were treated in such a discriminatory manner by Saudis that they actually really vehemently dislike them. I think Pakistanis don't quite realize how much Saudi ideology has seeped through into the country without them quite realizing it, right? And so we have seen sort of them turn against Sufi Islam and turn to kind of a more puritanical version of Islam and sort of raise their finger against the dhamal dances that occur in Sufi shrines as being something that's non-Islamic, that's un-Islamic, that's almost akin to blasphemy, and so that has seeped through. You actually see Arabic on number plates in Pakistan now. Number plates are for cars. License plates are instead of Pakistan, they say Al-Pakistan, which is an Arab. They literally actually say this, which was shocking to me. And this has only happened in the last 10 years or so, right? So it has seeped through without the population quite realizing how it has done so.
So is that partially because the military and the civilian narrative don't speak of Saudi Arabia in a critical light? Is it, if you kind of look at the book and it says that a lot of these views are from the infrastructure of the state, would it be partially because of that?
Absolutely. So they don't say. It's very interesting who they choose to say something about and what they choose not to say anything about. And of course, they're very quick to blame others for Pakistan's problems, and the finger is either pointed to the east or to the west, and the west meaning farther afield, right, towards the U.S., for instance. But Saudi Arabia is kind of either spoken of in a positive light or not talked about too much.
I would just say something brief about China and Saudi Arabia. On Saudi, I think, as Madiha said, what you see is cultural influence in driving some of the Arabization in dress, in a view of what proper Islamic practice should look like. What worries me is not necessarily Saudi-funded madrasas, because the Saudi Islamic view doesn't gain a lot of traction in Pakistan, but it is the Saudi advocacy of an extremely sectarian anti-Shia view of what the religious community is and what the boundary of the religious community is. Pakistan has had a fairly freewheeling sort of social fabric when it comes to Sunni and Shia issues. I mean, there's been a history of tension, but it wasn't until the 80s, in part with Saudi Arabia's help, that the line between the Sunni majority and the Shia minority became much brighter, and the conflict became much more apparent. Saudi Arabia continues to feed this and drive this in very unhelpful ways. On China, I think one of the most, interesting sort of second-order implications of what Madiha's laid out in her book is that it is very hard for an outsider, an outside country, to change these extremist dynamics without engaging the root of those dynamics in the Pakistani state. The United States tried for decades, through our engagement, through our investment, through lots of money, to try to help Pakistan modernize, right? And in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, there was a whole development theory about modernization and how these kind of investments would help Pakistan become a, quote, modern state. Well, there's a much more realistic view in Washington now. Like, we can't just give money and expect Pakistan and Pakistani society to change. That realization hasn't quite come to Beijing, right? China is investing huge amounts of money in Pakistan, billions of dollars in infrastructure, in energy, all kinds of things. And there is still, I think, a somewhat outdated view in China that with these investments will come a more rational view of Pakistan's own problems, and that extremism will, this will somehow ameliorate the problems of extremism in Pakistan. I think it's true that massive investment could ameliorate some of the negative trend lines on infant mortality, poverty, and so forth. But I think it's unrealistic to expect that these investments are going to change views on extremism of the kind that Madiha talked about, because they're rooted in incentives that the state has to do certain things and to propagate certain views through the education system, through the media, and other places. And I think China is becoming more sophisticated about this, but still fundamentally has unrealistic expectations about what its investment is going to do for Pakistan and to Pakistan. And that's where a little lessons learned exchange from the United States, we're like, gosh, guys, this was actually really hard, didn't work out the way we wanted, I think is actually quite productive as China pivots to being Pakistan's main patron in a number of domains.
If I could just add sort of one way in which Saudi ideologies have permeated into the mainstream in Pakistan is it is more through the grassroots, in the sense that it doesn't come from the top necessarily, but through the madrasas, through Pakistan's, again, madrasas are sort of something that the Pakistani state has let proliferate. And in these madrasas, as Saudi ideology has seeped through, the way it comes through to the rest of the population is not through their attendance of madrasas, but through the fact that madrasa students, the two jobs that they go on to have are either as imams of mosques, leaders of mosques, or as Islamic studies teachers in public or government schools. And through those two avenues, that ideology can be then transmitted on to the vast majority of the population.
I would say SAIS students have many more employment outcomes, many more successful employment outcomes.
And Josh is actually one of our success stories. He got his PhD here. I will say, I should add that the Pakistanis have taken kind of surgical actions when the Chinese have asked them to on very specific cases of extremism. And the Chinese are concerned about Uyghur militants that have made their way into the tribal areas of Pakistan. So that's a concern for them, and they want to make sure that that border is secured. And a couple of times Chinese nationals were attacked by militants in Islamabad. The government had taken action. So, and I think that American policymakers and others probably have misinterpreted those the Pakistani reaction for being more strategic than it is. And I see it more in the vein of Pakistan is doing for China what it often has done for the United States. In cases of, there's a important American official traveling to Islamabad. Suddenly, this well-known wanted terrorist is jailed by the Pakistani military and then released several weeks later. So we know this kind of play, and I think Josh is right. They're going to be in for a rude awakening if they think that investing in kind of the economic infrastructure of the country is going to get them anywhere in this other space. Okay, with that, I'll open it up to questions. We have about 15 minutes. When you ask your question, make sure it's a question, introduce yourself and your affiliation.
My name is Geert, I'm an alumnus here, and I wonder why, especially the West worries. I wonder why the West worries about the 1 to 5% terrorists in those countries, where the real problem is the 70% who favor death penalties if you're not if you leave your religion, if you're an atheist, or if you're a non-Muslim. And there are about 55 countries, Islamic or let's say Muslim countries in the world, and most of them have apostasy and blasphemy laws, and you never hear about this. So I think that it's not just the Pakistani military or the state that induces it, it's the entire West multicultural political correctness that points to terrorism as the real problem, whereas the real problem is 70% of the population. I mean, not the population, but the views on our Western values, essentially.
No, yeah. So I mean, I agree with you in the sense that so we saw with this Trump administration that it's not even concerned about the terrorists that it strike Pakistan itself, right? Not even concerned about those. Really has focused its attention, for instance, only on the terrorists that strike targets in Afghanistan that are either U.S. forces or Afghan targets that sort of affect the outcome of the war in Afghanistan, right? Not focused. And now it's starting to talk about the Lashkar-e-Taiba, but the focus really was very minutely focused on sort of terrorists. With the Obama administration, the focus was more on the Obama administration took out TTP militants in drone strikes, and so it was more on terrorists at large, sort of more broadly in Pakistan, but not on extremism. And so in some ways, I think that is my argument. We're kind of missing the forest for the trees. But the problem is that this is not the US's battle to fight. This is Pakistan's battle to fight. Pakistan is not going to take American advice on getting rid of its blasphemy laws or changing people's views on apostasy, because this is very fundamentally a way that something that Pakistan has engaged in, and it's seen these outcomes. It did not, in my view, understand that these would be the outcomes that it would be confronted with, right? It undertook its decision for strategic and political reasons, for unifying its sort of ethnically fragmented, politically sort of fragmented new nation, and it has stuck with that, and we see the outcomes that we see. But this is Pakistan's. This is in some ways the reason why the U.S. has steered away from focusing on the extremism bit of it is the exact correct reason, because anything the U.S. says is not going to change Pakistanis' views. It may very well be able to convince the Pakistani state in discussions and tell the Pakistani state that, in fact, these are the problems that are posing an existential threat to yourself, but it cannot change attitudes. That's just not in our control. In fact, anything we do from this side will worsen things.
And also, I mean, I served in 2010, 2011 in the Obama administration, and I would say that our goal was not to fight extremism.
Extremism being 70% of the population,
right.
Who think that
right.
death penalty is okay.
So there's two. I would say there's two separate issues that you're talking about. One is fighting extremism and fighting a culture of extremism, and then there's counterterrorism, which is what the U.S. was engaged in. And the purpose of that was of the U.S. activities in Pakistan was to dismantle a network of foreign militants who were engaging with Pakistani militants in groups and being facilitated in some cases by them. But they were using the physical space of Pakistan for all of the reasons that Madiha explained, to attack the United States or to conduct attacks on U.S. interests. That was the specific goal. It was not, and Madiha's right, like the U.S. is not a credible actor in trying to get Pakistan to change anything related to religion or culture, and especially now. So I think that as a intelligent kind of observer of these issues, you have to ask the question that you ask. But when you're the official government kind of working with another government, it's a completely different conversation. And we've tried it though, and we've failed miserably.
We failed with terrorism fights.
I'll give you another example, and then I'll open it up to other questions. The Bush administration had a huge agenda of democratization and promoting democracy in the Middle East. What happened in the Middle East after the Bush administration left? And so I think some of it is really out of our control, and I think that's what your book illustrates, is that most of it is out of our control, and it's up to the Pakistani
Let me say
state.
very, very briefly on this. I'm very disturbed by the views of apostasy, but I think this is reflective of a group that feels under siege or that feels insecure. Right? When you begin drawing the boundaries of who's in and who's out, and this has happened more and more, the sectarian discussion. Well, the Sunnis now say the Shia are out, and then this group of Sunnis say those group of Sunnis aren't in the club anymore. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think this reflects an insecurity. And this is precisely why commentary from the outside, but the United States or anybody else, just reinforces that insecurity rather than ameliorating it, which is why it's important for Pakistani people, Pakistani leaders, to address it from the inside, because those are issues that are only exacerbated by commenting from the outside, very, very unfortunately.
This is another SAIS grad asking us the hardest question could possibly ask us. So in the back there, all the way in the back.
Hello, my name is Utsav.
Please stand.
My name is Utsav Chakrabarti. I'm in the World Hindu Council. And my question is to both Joshua and Madiha. Has there been ever any conversation with the Pakistanis, when Madiha, you were at the ground and when Joshua was at the White House, regarding the fact that they don't teach anything about their own history? Pakistanis have been Hindus and Buddhists for 3,000 years and Muslims for 800 years. If they just acknowledge this fact in their curriculum, half the problem is gone.
Yeah, so I mean, I go through the curriculum in a great deal of detail in my book in chapter 4, which is the chapter on education, and as you mentioned, the Pakistan studies textbooks literally start off with the arrival of Muslims in the subcontinent, and so they focus excessively on the sort of the campaign in some ways, right? The struggle for Pakistan and why Pakistan was created, and because that's why the books are a part of Pakistan's nationalist project to define itself, and it wants to get its views across to students, to the next generation of Pakistani citizens, and so it has to justify its existence. And the easiest way to justify its existence is to ignore the aspects of the shared history and culture that it shares with India, because really, and that's again exactly why it relies on Islam, because that's what differentiates it from India. So yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, let me say this: textbooks were not like this before 1980. So Zia is the Pakistani leader who really engaged in this sort of cleansing and redefinition of textbooks. And because textbooks have now become a provincial subject, there are efforts, in particular in Sindh, to bring back some of the history that is sort of the non-Islamic history of Pakistan. But textbooks, Pakistan's textbooks have facilitated its attitudes in the sort of larger environment that exists, where militant propaganda abounds and so on. But nationalist textbooks are a problem that are not that are not unique to Pakistan. They exist in India, they exist in Bangladesh, they exist in Israel, and beyond.
Hold on a second.
Hi, I'm Jeff Price. I'm an FBI fellow. And to the second structural dynamic that was discussed, the hostility toward India, we tend to just take this for granted, assume it, and then wring our hands about the consequences. And I wonder if I could ask you to think or talk more about the possibilities for normalizing a relationship between Pakistan and India, what the benefits of that would be, for instance, in trade, where there is a completely unnatural lack of trade between the two, and what the benefits might be of a more normal relationship in that regard.
I mean, in my view, the benefits of a normal relationship would be enormous. Not only would there be sort of the immediate benefits that would come from, from trade, sort of the economic benefits. And Pakistanis and Indians, by the way, in surveys say that they would love to engage in for the two countries to engage in more trade and interaction. So the benefits would not just be economic. In my view, the sort of the shedding of the anti-India paradigm would actually completely, because it would redefine how Pakistan sees itself, it would redefine many of these harmful, sort of policies that Pakistan has put in place. So, textbooks don't need to be anti-India anymore, and so on, right? So, and then people will blame India less for the problems that Pakistan has within it, and be able to self-examine. More broadly, sort of a positive definition of a country as opposed to a negative definition of a country, right? That is in opposition to another country. A positive definition of the country can be harnessed for, economic development within Pakistan, right? If you're constantly sort of existing in this sort of a notion of being defensive as opposed to actually proactively engaging in economic reform and really thinking of yourself as a vibrant state that is economically vibrant, the way that India does, Pakistan, the dividends will be enormous, not just the immediate dividends.
Josh, you've done some work in this regard.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, this is one of those things that would be wonderful. The structural incentives for outside players to be involved in anything other than a passive facilitation are very low. And I think they're in many ways getting lower because India, I think, quite naturally points to the agreement in the early 70s at Simla with Pakistan that the resolution of the Kashmir dispute is a bilateral matter between the two countries. And any sort of apparent movement by the United States toward attempts to engage more proactively are shut down very quickly by India. And the United States is increasingly invested economically, politically, and strategically with India. So it's difficult to see that paradigm changing. I would say the one place where there could be more active engagement is the good news story is that it might happen. The bad news story is that it would happen after a significant and problematic India-Pakistan war or crisis, right? There could be a broader effort to engage that problem set. But I think the United States has also moved away from the view that the Pakistani government sometimes puts forward that the problem in Afghanistan and Pakistan's behavior in Afghanistan is attributable to Kashmir, and therefore solving Kashmir would solve the problem in Afghanistan. I think solving Kashmir would be wonderful. It would certainly help a lot of other behaviors and problems, but I personally reject the sort of causal logic because I think it absolves Pakistan of dealing with its behavior in the Afghan theater. So that's sort of the ongoing debate, if you will.
I think so. It's just one sort of thing that I would add is as long as the military in Pakistan is in charge of its internal and external security policy, this is not going to happen. So civilian governments have tried, and the military has pushed back. Nawaz Sharif, in particular, has tried many times because he's the person who really wants to see Pakistan's kind of, or that's his base and that's sort of his whole stance is that he's making Pakistan into an economically vibrant country, right? And so trade would benefit his political future enormously. However, anytime he's tried, the military has pushed back. So the dominance of Pakistan's military really makes ensures that this doesn't happen?
And the way that the military pushes back can be varied, right? It can overtly push back. It can force politicians to make statements, as it typically does. Or you might randomly see an LET attack on some Indian interests in Afghanistan or somewhere else, and the occurrence of that activity then derails any kind of talks that were in progress. And this is a pattern that we've observed time and time again.
There are lots of coincidences in
So
South
lots
Asia.
of them. Yeah. There's a lot of them. Yes, over there. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Uzma Basim. I work here in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. It was a great diagnostic. I wanted to hear more about what can be done because it is kind of frustrating by now, listening to what has been happening and what are the root causes. Yes, I think most of us would agree. And I saw there was a lot of focus for what U.S. could do. Obviously, the external relations and dimensions are important. And I'm happy that somebody mentioned Saudi Arabia. But we need to look at, if we look at the two root causes, India and Saudi Arabia on the ideology side, how do we take these two root causes away? Because these are the two incentives. Internally, yes, I agree, Pakistan needs to do more, but they won't do it. They need to look at their curriculum, they need to change their education system, they need to do something about the extremist ideology, but how do we make them do it, right? And one dimension I have seen that, of course, there is one way everybody attacks army, and to some extent, it is important because we see that as a root cause, that they are driving everything, but it's not been working because one thing that we have recently seen within the army, there are fissures, right? It's not as coherent a group as it claims to be, or it used to be. So they are also threatened from inside their institution. And that's why they are trying to build themselves, like keep themselves together, that no. We can't go after all these Islamists because half of our army believes that they are brothers. And since we cultivated them, we can't really have a coup within ourselves, right? So that's one dimension that need to come out. And if you are not attacking them directly, then how do you make them toe a line or go outside that paradigm they're so used to? And US factor, yes, US been trying, failing. China, you are saying, wouldn't be successful either. What else can be done? India is not helping either, because wherever there are election campaigns or there are statements coming out of there, of course, they provide a ground for Pakistanis to feel, see, they are still our enemy. They are trying to break us apart. And they are trying to attack our army, which is the only capable and strong institution Pakistan has. So it's their conspiracy again. So people like us who like to criticize our army, they are basically then...
I'm glad you brought that up.
They are basically saying, oh, you are traitors. So how do we resolve this dilemma?
What do you think?
In some way, you know, I go through the sort of in the final chapter of the book, I do go through sort of, you know, I've said the big thing is an ideological redefinition, but what are the smaller steps that Pakistan can take, and what would induce it to take these steps? In my view, what would induce it to take the steps on its curricula, on its laws, and I'm not saying get rid of the blasphemy law because that's not going to happen, but on reforming the law so that you know, the most extreme punishment is not death, but you know what it was before the new law was instituted, which is, you know, a few years in prison, right? I mean, you have to roll back things slightly. You can reform curricula so that they're more, so that they're less biased, so that they're less focused on religion and so on. So for those things, what needs to change is actually the state itself to realize how these policies, right? These laws, these curricula, its own politics, its own narratives have led to extremism. Realize the connection and realize how extremism is the problem. So in my view, and it has not come to that realization. You know, you hear people in Pakistan talk about this. They're still blaming They're still blaming others. They're not looking at the extremism that exists within Pakistan itself. In response to Donald Trump's tweets about Pakistan or policy against Pakistan, Pakistan has the state has gone on the defensive and said, look, we've eliminated terrorism in Pakistan, not talking about how extremism has actually, I would say, maybe even increased in the last couple of years because of the government giving into the demands of extremist groups that protest out in thousands of numbers in Islamabad, right? In 2016 and 2017. So until the state itself realizes the threat of extremism and how its own policies have put those kinds of have engendered those attitudes, we're not going to get anywhere. And then, I detail marginal steps the state can take on curricula, on laws that would be palatable to the population. Not, I'm not saying bring in Western textbooks. I'm not saying scrap all the problematic laws, but change them marginally so that they actually change attitudes. So the answer is, unfortunately, long term. It's not very exciting because it's going to be a slow slog to roll the damage that has been done for so many years, and in particular since the 80s back. So it's going to be maybe it'll take 100 years.
It's a long discussion, but I think marginal efforts have already been done and they didn't get us anywhere. Because people have tried changing the curriculum, they were pushed back so hard, and I agree with Joshua that because we are kind of in a bind, we are not able to get out. Those marginal steps are even more difficult.
But those marginal steps are half-hearted. I wouldn't say that I'm not saying the marginal step should be marginally change the curriculum. I'm saying change the curriculum, right? Not the marginal changing of the curriculum that occurred in Musharraf's time. And I discussed that in detail as well. I'm saying Pakistan does this thing called, it engages in reform in a way that's sort of isomorphic mimicry. It engages in the motions of a reform without actually changing anything. That doesn't work. Change things. So I'll stop there.
On that note, please join me in thanking Madiha and Josh for a really fascinating conversation. The book is available back there. Thank you for your time. Have a good day, everyone.